Once we know what a consumer's relevant marginal willingness to pay curve looks like, we can move on to asking what was the consumer's total willingness to pay for the goods that she actually purchased, and from that we can determine what her consumer surplus was. Let's begin then with a marginal willingness to pay curve, the one we derived in graph 10.1 and then again in graph 10.2 when we saw that it was the same as a compensated demand curve. Notice that the marginal willingness to pay label is superscripted with an A, indicating that it was derived from the indifference curve that contains bundle A. That bundle A from the consumer diagram in turn corresponds to a point A that lies on the marginal willingness to pay curve at the price P that is actually being charged for gasoline, and it results in the consumer actually purchasing the quantity QA. Thus, while the marginal willingness to pay curve is not the same as the own price demand curve, it does contain the point A in common. In other words, the own price demand curve also passes through A in this picture, telling us that the consumer at the price P will in fact purchase QA. The area underneath the marginal willingness to pay curve, all the way up to point A, is then what we call the total willingness to pay for the quantity QA of gasoline that the consumer is actually purchasing. You can convince yourself of this by asking yourself how much was the consumer willing to pay for the first gallon of gasoline, and the second, and the third. The marginal willingness to pay curve tells you the answer to that. For the first gallon of gasoline, the consumer was willing to pay an amount that's given by the height of that marginal willingness to pay curve times 1 gallon. Thus, when we try to figure out the consumer's total willingness to pay for all QA gallons of gasoline, we have to add up a bunch of narrow areas underneath the marginal willingness to pay curve. The narrow area that tells us how much the consumer was willing to pay for the first gallon, and the one that tells us how much the consumer was willing to pay for the second gallon, and the third gallon, and so forth. And when we do that, we get the shaded area as the total willingness to pay for the quantity QA. When the consumer gets to buy gasoline at the price of P per gallon, however, she doesn't have to pay her total willingness to pay. For the first gallon, she just has to pay P, not the entire distance all the way up to the marginal willingness to pay curve, and similarly for the second and the third and so forth. So the total that she pays for the gasoline is given by P times QA, which is just the rectangle that's shaded in green here. When we subtract that green rectangle from the shaded blue area underneath the marginal willingness to pay curve, we then get the difference between how much a consumer would have been willing to pay for the QA gallons of gasoline and how much she actually had to pay. In other words, we get an estimate of the consumer surplus that this individual got by being able to purchase at a price P rather than paying her entire marginal willingness to pay for each of the gallons of gasoline that she actually purchased. One way to think of consumer surplus is then to think of how much a consumer would be willing to pay to enter a market where she's able to purchase gasoline at the price P. If she's able to make herself better off by the consumer surplus by buying at P the quantity QA, then that's the amount she'd be willing to pay to enter this market.